A couple of observations, the model, and then I'll explain why this is principally required and then why it's pragmatically beneficial. On the model, note that this debate is about matters of public health, which means that there are largely health impacts that affect the entire community and are broad spread. I don't think this debate is about abortion, for example. We think broadly it occurs on the state level, the federal level, whichever body is endowed with the right to make decisions regarding public health, and we think multiple referenda can occur on those different levels if different communities want different things. In terms of policies in this debate, first, note that this is about curtailments of individual freedom. And yeah, these days might sort of, well, yeah, it's about masks. I know that probably wasn't that great of an example, but in many cases there are very legitimate trade-offs to things like locking people up, not allowing them go to work, and allow entire state economy to occur. We think vaccines are also probably quite legitimate for people that actually have opposition to this sort of thing. And lastly, on the model, a couple of observations about public health crises. The first is that note that these things tend to be extraordinarily fast-moving, which means they develop very, very quickly, and they cause people to, and they require genuinely a very fast response on the side of the government. The second is that public health crises affect many different people in many different ways, which means that there are an extraordinarily diverse array of stakeholders. It's very hard for the government to aggregate those things. Any clarification?
Clarification.
Sure.
Suppose there's a public health policy passed that's effective in 1 week. When do you hold the referendum?
Yeah, tomorrow.
Okay.
No point.
Okay. So first, on the principle. So a couple of things to say here. The first is that we think that this is required under the democratic principle of decision making. A point that this is principally justified. Note that this is a decision that curtails freedom, and we think that an exercise, for example, we think that an exercise of a curtailment of freedom is an imposition of the government's monopoly in force. That tends to not be justified unless you have decision making coming from the bottom. That is to say that a state is a fiction. The individuals who buy into the state agree to give their power to the state because they believe it is legitimate for them to do so, but it requires them to consent in that political process, and we think that jettisoning this democratic principle is principally unjustified use of force in this particular case. A couple of things to say here. The first is that they might say that, oh yeah, we jettison democracy all the time, for example, in cases like the Federal Reserve and monetary policy. A point is that obviously in some of those extreme cases it's extraordinarily impractical to hold referendum, but we think generally if it were a practical thing to do, it would be very difficult to do so. And the second is that generally speaking, these are not necessarily always good outcomes. For example, look at all the states around the world that have not held referendum and made decisions like zero COVID in China, which are likely very and arguably very detrimental to those states. Second, we think that there's an epistemic benefit here. A couple of things to say. One, I think what I said about the multiplicity of stakeholders that are involved in this process. Many stakeholders have very, very different decisions. It's extraordinarily difficult in a state in a couple of month period of time to decide upon what the most important thing to do is and aggregate the preferences of all these individuals. Second is that note that many of these trade-offs are genuinely legitimate, as I said in my introduction. And last, a referendum gives you direct insight into the opinions of the people, so you don't have to go through the difficult and oftentimes complex system of representative democracy to do so. But second, in this case, why do we think it's justified to overgo representative democracy in particular? First, observe that this is a motion that affects everyone. It is a public health crisis, and the curtailment of freedom also affects everyone. But second, I think representative democracy in this particular case is probably somewhat impractical because it is, as I said, a extraordinarily fast-moving thing that affects many, many people, and it's very difficult for that to rise to the top. But lastly, most importantly, this tends to be a very fast-changing thing. You might have, elected leaders 4 years ago for a particular purpose and trusted them to pass certain policies, but you might not trust them to pass policy in this particular case, and for this particular policy, which is why we think a referendum is beneficial. On to the pragmatic benefits here, before that opening.
Yeah, I understand that it's moving really quickly. Can you explain to me why serving 26 million Australians is faster than serving 200 people that's in Parliament?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I told you about why it was important to get the opinions on every single person. It is not just speed. We have to thread the needle between speed, and we think a referendum is, relatively faster than systems of representative democracy. But at the same time, you also have to balance the fact that it's very difficult for those 200 experts to have the opinion of everybody in mind. That, as I said, many of these times these policies are not morally inert, which is to say that people actually have to make decisions about whether staying in home and having economic decline and economic destruction for their families is a morally more important thing than their exposure to the virus. Right? This is not the technocracy in the sense that you can just solve for an optimization equation as to what utility is. I think people actually have to make decisions on the morality of this, which is why we think you can't bypass the democratic principle, but we do think this is a more effective democratic way of doing so. Closing.
The question was about Parliament. all of the choices that you're talking about are already made by elected officials, but we recognize that it is better for us to have some
Okay, my bad. Yeah, I
responded.
responded. So the Parliament point, I definitely responded to above. I explained why you had to particularly jettison representative democracy in this case, because you would not be able to understand the preferences of the public in that way, and people have decisions that are constantly changing. So that was the explanation for why we thread the needle. The pragmatics. One, why does this give us a higher speed of execution? This also responds to the representative democracy point. 8 point, politics take time, which is to say that if you want people to get buy-in to your policy, it requires you to go around and make concessions to other political leaders to make sure that you have the benefit of being able to do something like this. Most of the time people will make minor changes and minor decisions to the policy because they want to see themselves as a politician who is representing their people. So they have a bias towards trying to make change when none is actually necessary. B point, many politicians are risk averse. That is to say they don't understand whether their constituency actually supports something or doesn't support something, which means they'll try to wait till the very last minute until they understand or get better clarity into what people's preferences are, but it's very difficult to do so, and that's something that also takes a lot of time as well. C, I just think, generally speaking, it's really hard to gauge the popularity of people. Polling tends to be wildly inaccurate. You don't know if another politician is going to respond and slam you for your policy and you're going to get unpopular, which means that even if it doesn't take that much time, it's something that you'll bias against action, which is why we don't think representative democracy is successful in this space. But secondly, I think this creates a vast depoliticization of the public health system, which is extraordinarily important. And I think the U.S. example of COVID is not necessarily all of the debates, but it is a very, very illustrative example of this. That's to say, there was no pure reason on principle why, for example, Trump and the Republican Party needed to stand against masks and stand against vaccines. I think a big part of it was just simply because Biden had a big push at the very beginning. He got there first on telling people that COVID was an important thing. And because of the political process where you want to see yourselves as a better politician, and specifically you want to discredit other politicians that are saying important things because of the nature of the political process, you're likely ask Trump to say, well, yeah, that guy's just lying. COVID is not a real thing at all, and spread a ton of misinformation. We think this creates terrible incentives. That doesn't exist on our side of the house because it's a referendum for the people and by the people down at the very, very bottom. But lastly, why do we get better public information that allows people to make informed decisions on our side of the house? A couple of things to say here. The 8 point is the point about depoliticization. It is very hard for you as a public health official that should be morally inert to operate, particularly under a regime that is very, very polarized. Take, Fauci being scared of saying anything because he thought that the Trump administration was just going to slam him. B point, you get higher public trust because people don't see governments as making decisions that either spread their power, as people believe in Hong Kong, but they believe that because they have control of a referendum, they can actually make decisions that are in their benefit, so they trust sources from the government that are likely to tell them information. See, people making this decision makes them informed because they research the policy and it's something that they do. Very, very practical.
I think that speaker is one leader of opposition. Sit here. Is everybody ready? 3, 2, 1. Gee whiz, am I glad that the Brexit referendum had no misinformation of the public that led to the dire consequence of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, thanks to all the framing that the opening government team felt like they needed to give you. Look, I think that their case is patently absurd. I'm going to go through 2 reasons why I think that is at the top, then I'll integrate the rest into our case, which is going to explain to you firstly why the structure of a referendum is fundamentally incompatible with that of a public health crisis, and second, why we think that it has adverse harms in the way that people vote. So, first thing that I want to note here is the very fast-moving nature that they talk about of the public health crisis. I think this is the fundamental crux of their case that they will fall down on in this debate for a few reasons. Firstly, referendums are structurally unable to edit the outcome of that referendum, even if it is good, over time as the conditions of a public health situation change. So maybe a lockdown is not appropriate when you don't have any cases in Australia, but it is quite appropriate as soon as your cases start escalating really quickly, but you don't have the capacity to very quickly issue another referendum. That's why countries don't hold referendums or plebiscites very often. The last one that happened in my country happened almost 10 years ago for the reason it took literally 3 years to plan to ask people about a question as to whether same-sex marriage should be legitimately recognised as a marriage or not. right? Usually these are really important amendments to things like constitutions, not the things that they're talking about. They're very slow-moving, that stands antithetical to these cases. Secondly, though, I just think that they're massively prone to the misinformation that they tell you that they are. Specifically, that every political party that they're telling you about having incentives to misinform the public has that incentive amplified. But now you have things like business councils that tell small business owners that they don't actually want to lock down because it's not in their business interest to do that. Because referendums don't ask you about the detailed nuances of government policy to address the job loss that happens as a result of a pandemic. They don't tell you that the government will compensate you financially for the fact that you've lost your job. They will instead say you'll lose customers and you'll lose your business, you'll therefore lose your livelihood, and you're going to sign that ballot in a very particular way as a result of being marketed that in a very particular direction. So I don't buy the rationale that they think that every perspective is legitimate, even the people who think that you're being microchipped by aliens, and that they should have an equal say in the process of a public health administration that is currently coordinated by experts in a very technocratic capacity. Firstly, then, on the structure of referendum, why they're incompatible with these crises. I note two things about public health crises. Some of this is probably repetitive of OG. The first is that they're changeable and that they're very quickly moving. We went through a number of waves of the COVID-19 pandemic that were each characteristically very different in their spread, in their efficacy. We know that the Delta variant was substantially worse than the Omicron variant, not least because of vaccination rates, but also because of the mutation of the virus itself. Referenda are structurally unlikely to be able to respond to the changing nature of a pandemic, which means that a decision not to do something, not to curtail rights in the most immediate case, is unlikely to be reversed as soon as it needs to happen because people are already sunk onto the cost or attached to the rights that they think that they have thanks to all of the marketing that they have received as a result of the first referendum passage, meaning that the first referendum outcome is likely to stick. It's not clear how long it is likely to stick for because nobody can predict a public health crisis in terms of duration, though experts can model how bad it will be in severity, and that those things can be addressed, though they won't be addressed on a ballot. I reject there, obviously, the claim that Gov makes that people are super well informed. I just don't think this is true on face. People aren't politically well informed. That's why people vote for politicians like Trump on the basis that they'll keep their jobs in southern states, despite the fact that there were massive job losses. I'll take closing.
What are your structural reasons for us not being able to do referendums many times because you haven't provided anyone in your circuit?
So many. One, I don't know if you've listened to any of my speech. They take ages to orchestrate. Secondly, they're really expensive. The reason why the representative democracy works, that they tell you about, is exactly the reason that they tell you about, that we already have a representative democracy, that you already elect representatives to represent you in a democracy. To the extent that that exists, you go to the ballot box and you vote in a particular direction so that you are able to effectively defer the power that you have over decision making to an elected representative. It is weird for opening government to have this odd characterization that all of a sudden, this is the one thing that you really don't trust them on, but you trust them on everything else that they decide on 4 years. I just don't think this is true. I think people have generally good levels of trust in the government. They generally think that they're making the right decisions. As soon as it comes to things like vaccination and public health in particular, because these are topics that individuals happen not to understand. But second, people are intrinsically selfish, and COVID, for example, is unconceptualizable. That is, I have no idea what an airborne virus could mean for me if I have never had COVID. I didn't have it until literally 2 weeks ago, and so my adjudication of risk was probably completely wrong in the way that I live my life, because I know that I did not experience it, because I know that I'm not at particular risk of adverse health outcomes as a result of contracting COVID-19. But because I'm making those in my self-interest, I'm not considering the people who stand to lose the most. The economic implications of things like not locking down and spreading a virus further, leading to massive hospitalizations, leading to the inability to access health infrastructure in a state that I may actually eventually need, because those things are unable to be predicted by myself. Because people are selfish in the way that they make decisions. Because they're likely to make decisions that are structurally incompatible with what public health crises demand, which is a very clear, very science-oriented approach to the correct scientific decision. It is not a question of democratizing to see if you think the virus is real or if it is not real, if you think vaccines work or they don't, because we know that they do. And it is important that governments stand behind the factual evidence that they do, so that they don't put the credibility of all of science, because it isn't just to do with the pandemic, but the whole scientific community more broadly, up in the air if they want to. I'll take OG if you have anything at this point.
Yeah, governments don't want to change policy either, because if they do so quickly, they constantly flip-flop their voter bases and trust them. Why is this super symmetric? The US doesn't change policies every day.
This is so untrue. The lockdowns happened, then they were lifted. Then the lockdowns happened, then they were lifted. The US government had no problem with changing the policy as it related to lockdowns. The CDC had no problem lifting the regulations around the mask mandate or changing it from 14 days of isolation to 5. Governments make these changes all the time. There's no reason to believe that they can't do this. They can even do this more rapidly. They're appealing to less people in a constituent body body that is solely dedicated to the representation of individuals on what is likely to be the most important issue at that point in time. So I just don't accept that that argument is particularly legitimate. So then, why do people vote poorly? Why do I think people are very much short-termist and they can't view things in the same way that I explained to you that I could not conceptualize of COVID-19? Because it appears to be an abstract conceptual thing that I can't myself engage with. And I don't hear that people defer their rights to the government in this way all the time. They do things like agree to seatbelts, to taxes, that people don't consent to every single policy that is passed by government because it is structurally designed to be representative of them. And in states where it is not representative of them, this debate makes no marginal difference, right? Secondly though, because these referendum are binding, as I told you about earlier, you're unlikely to be able to renovate based on the latest public health advice and double down on the perspective that you had earlier that is likely to be antithetical for science. But also because the government literally employs people to model the results of public health crises that you might not yourself be able to see or be able to understand. Because governments look at long-term costs in order to keep the country prosperous over time. Because as much as people in debate like to believe that election cycles only promote politicians for 4 years, they have incentives for re-election, but they also have incentives for the country not going to total shit in the next sort of 10 years that they exist there. Secondly though, I just think people trust each other less. This is a really big problem. I think there's massive infighting within populations that happen when you start to suspect certain demographic groups are voting in a particular direction when it comes to these referenda. I think this tears society apart much more than people not trusting the government, which is the worst one in their case. So I'm incredibly proud of
Alright, I think the speaker and call the Deputy Prime Minister to here.
First, I just want to note that democracies are not made to engineer particular outcomes. It may be true that in the particular context of this COVID crisis in one particular country, we have certain beliefs about which policies should have been implemented. That does not mean that overall we believe that public health policies should always be implemented in a particular way, that they should be implemented earlier, that they should be implemented more severely, that we should care more about the long term than the short term. These are decisions that individuals should be able to make about their own lives and about their own governance. What is the reasoning provided to you for this? That the average individual gives up massive rights to the states. And this is one of the cases in which the state calls back in those rights. They say that you cannot do certain things, that you have to shut down your businesses, that you have to do things that significantly affect your particular life, that may affect your religious practices. We say that that's, in many cases, incredibly harmful. It isolates people from their religious communities. It means that people who have invested many millions, like thousands of dollars and lots of hard work into their businesses are more likely to shut down. It means that people in many cases have to violate their strongly held individual personal beliefs. And their only response here is that doesn't get to an outcome that we like. Maybe people don't have information. Maybe people don't consider their biases correctly. I think that every person is an expert on their own beliefs, and to the extent that they might not have good information, there's a strong incentive for A, states and public health officials to provide that information, but B, for the average individual to get more informed about those particular issues so they can vote on it. I think the huge thing is this. If an average person votes in an election, they vote in an election because they feel like Tucker Carlson convinced them about the culture war is broadly right and the Republicans are broadly right. When the average person votes in this referendum, they're voting specifically on a particular public health issue that does not have to be attached to a broader political stance. I think that's much more likely to get the average individual involved, but also, crucially, preserves their rights. We think that it's massively important that you respect those particular individuals' rights for those reasons. Okay, few responses to OO. Yeah.
Okay, so if that's so, then why would you ever pass any type of blanket law that would restrict individual freedom? Why don't you just let everyone choose whether or not they would get vaccinated or put a mask on?
Because obviously, Brian, there are implications on other people, which is why we have public health laws, which is why we need to have discussions around what sorts of things we are allowed to tolerate for public health. So you might care about your grandma, you might also care about your business. The question is, to what extent do you value that trade-off? We say that this is a discussion that the society needs to have and to vote on. Okay, next, in terms of the structure, the things that Willow said. Firstly, they say the structure of referendum is bad. Firstly, there's no reason why we can't do many referendum. You never come up with an idea just shut down in a week. Clearly what happens is the referendum comes earlier on in an earlier planning stage, like it would under their side of the House. Because in order for a policy to work, you have to set up enforcement mechanisms. You have to think through how it would happen. You need to think through how you would support businesses that would be affected by the lockdown. You need to think through how you would be communicating it to the people. And moreover, due to the nature of the crisis, you would likely know long ahead of time that you would have to consider lockdowns because, for instance, you know that there is a virus emerging and you've begun to study it already. Clearly, after COVID, we would know that this is a huge issue. Secondly, just do it over the weekend. People have the ability to go to church basically every Sunday. People have the ability to vote in snap elections in parliaments all over the globe. We see no reason why you can't have referendums relatively often. If it is true that the structure of a referendum is so bad and we can't get people's opinions, then they have no ability to access people's opinions under their side of the house either way, unless they have just really, really shitty polls that are getting really, really limited information. We say that the only ability to access information is just to ask people what they want. We say we ask people what they want. Probably not going to be perfect, but it's going to be a hell of a lot better than just leaving it up to the politicians and not actually asking people. And also, the changes that they mentioned happen over a period of months, not over a period of days. So clearly we're not talking about a referendum every week. We're talking about a referendum every few weeks at most. Next, they say business councils just tell small business owners how to vote. But the difference is that on our side, it's a discussion, right? Business owners can decide for themselves what they value and what would be best for their businesses. Maybe they do care about the long-run economy. The issue is that when the top-level executives at businesses can just lobby particular politicians for what they want in the short term because their returns are decided on the quarterly scale as opposed to small business owners who care about the long-term growth of their business, that means that other people don't have buy-in to that policy. That means that smaller business owners are completely left out and can't make that decision for themselves, but it also means that the average person on the ground who's not a business owner does not have buy-in to that policy. They say people aren't important. I think that people actually do tune in the status quo. But the thing is that they tune in and don't really think about what they are listening to. They tune in generically to the culture war. I think that what we encourage is that for them to think harder and engage more deeply because they have to go up and actually do the ballot. I think that people understand the significance of this policy more under our side of the house and therefore engage more deeply in thought about this particular issue and the public health implications of it. I want to note that the context of this debate is important. We are not debating in a world where COVID did not happen yet. We are debating in a world where the public health community has been proved right, where Republicans are broadly already acknowledging that vaccines are beneficial in many cases, where they're saying that, oh, I'll get shots, but only insofar as I absolutely need to, where Donald Trump even got the vaccine, where many people acknowledge that lockdowns are necessary and beneficial in reducing cases in many countries around the world. We know that the public health officials have been right, and we say that more people buy into this, and we know that the public health issue is going to be supported under our side of the house. I think, moreover, that some people just don't engage much because the state isn't reaching out to them. We incentivize the state to reach out to them and have the levers of active local politicians reaching out as opposed to large state media apparatus that is seen as very long, a long distance. Okay, so also, by the way, opening QI?
Yeah, so I don't understand this argument at all. You're saying that the state doesn't reach out to them on a local level. What do you think an election is?
An election is a variety of things where you're talking broadly about the economy, broadly about meme culture in some cases, broadly about a whole ton of other issues, and also, in many cases, does not reach the actual average individual. It feels like the DNC reaching out to you as opposed to the state reaching out to you and genuinely caring about you. So we think that it's less likely under their side of the house because politicians are seen as self-interested as opposed to a vote which is literally just trying to get your information. Okay, so why is this going to be better under our side of the house? The first thing that we told you is that politicians are much more likely to be risk-averse in proposing policies if it cannot be confirmed by a referendum. Now, this is, again, different from polling because if you can't be confirmed by a referendum, no one's ever going to believe that your policy was actually popular, particularly when there's populist opposition, as we'll talk about in a second. What is the populist opposition? I think that in many cases, there are genuinely popular policies, like for instance, state-run healthcare in America that people cannot opt out of, that is beneficial and supported widely by voters, even in places like West Virginia. But people like Joe Manchin still oppose it. Why is this the case? Because they're paid off by big interests, because they're inherently conservative, because there's huge party platforms behind them, and they can claim that this is unpopular, even if in fact it is popular. I think that these oppositional parties feel these incentives for all those reasons, but they also feel this because they are an oppositional party, and they don't want the major party that is in government right then to get the win of proposing a policy that is actually good. Under our side of the house, we can divorce it more from the parties because it's not seen as Joe Biden's policy only, as Joe Biden passed, but rather as the American people's policy that we are much more willing to sign onto. I think that's going to be better under our side of the house and decreases the fracturing that we get under their side. The second thing to point out is that corporate interests are going to have much more control under their side, and corporate interests often bias against good public health. Why? Because there's the short-termist incentive that we just talked about under their side of the house. So the referendum is much more likely to be politicized under their side. Why is that important? Because the de facto implementation is changed. Because when people actually socially distance, whether the restaurant actually asks you to wear a mask, whether people actually schedule their vaccine appointment for now as opposed to later, is hugely determined by whether people feel like they were consulted in the process, that they had the good information, they were actually asked. On their side of the house, they just blame politicians and say they did unpopular things. On our side, they were involved in the process. They're much more likely to buy in, much more likely to support it. Very, very proud.
Okay, I think that speaker and call upon the deputy leader of opposition. Here.
So
This is ironic, but I misplaced my mask. Does anyone have an extra one?
Oh, I want it. Yeah, here you go.
Thank you so much.
Would you say believe in COVID? Yes, no. Oh no. I have another one.
No, I can. This is happens a lot.
There's another one.
Yeah,
Fair enough.
I have a big head. This is happening a lot.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. They give us no reasons why we ought to care about the principles of democracy at all. I don't think it's really important. Here's what we say. Why do we generally care about democracy, and what could they have said? Generally, we think as a society that we need to aggregate preferences as a general stance on morality. The reason this is the case is we often think things like abortion or taxes or some sort of imposition on you, and the best way to determine this is to say, what do people generally decide? The problem is that everyone has a preference against death, and we all agree that it's morally bad, or I would say almost everyone has a preference against death, which means it doesn't really matter about the immorality or immorality of this thing. We ought to preserve life as a prerequisite to anything else, which means your preferences about wearing a mask always will come secondary to someone else's preferences to be alive. That's why I think we have strong requirements in order to protect other people. But even in the issues where we do think democracy is inherently valuable, in order to determine morality, in order to be the best way of aggregating people's preferences, we still think representative democracy is an effective solution to these things. There's no reason given why we shouldn't just vote for this on every single issue that in any way curtails people's rights. So I don't know why it's the case that we would need to do these types of things, because we do believe that someone can represent my votes more accurately than I can in some cases, because I can't pay attention. Because instead I trust someone else to do the research on these issues and do these things, because I literally just don't have time to do these things. Finally, I think we just are okay with violating rights in general, because we don't want to live in some sort of state of anarchy. It is necessary to avoid. So therefore we are perfectly acceptable to limits of the rights of individuals. Why do we think it's even if you go to the most basic, their conception of the state, the basic most conception of the state is protection from violence, because you ought not to do this. A public health conception is a type of violence. Therefore, principally, we ought to do this in the most basic form of the state, ought to do everything we can to protect these people. I think this means when Nicole tells you about why people are likely to vote in really bad ways that go against their preferences, ought not be considered, our ultimate priority should be restricting other people's rights, because every time, you are violating my right not to kill you when I can't stab you, but we still think that is probably a good restriction on my rights. These things are true. But second, I think on the democratic principle, I don't even think it's filled in this way. Why is this the case? One, I think it's just true that we've mandated vaccines for years and years. No one's really complained. But two, you don't fully have time to decide, because you're not even able to express your preference in this way. They tell you we're going to vote the next day. I can't research. I'm busy. I have a life outside. I can't suddenly do a bunch of research to figure out exactly what I want, which means my preference isn't actually realized, because I don't have the time to decide on this, because I don't have don't even know if I'm able to do these types of things. I can only say a yes-no vote in the first place, which means I can't get the nuances, details of policy, which is I might support some policy, but I might not support a mask mandate or a shutdown of businesses that also doesn't include loans and funding from the government. But the thing is, that's a yes-no vote, which aren't detailed in the referendum, because they're have to be fairly short. They got to fit on one piece of paper. This means I don't think it's even about a fulfillment. But second, a lot of people can't vote on this. The basic thing they tell you is it's going to be weekend. One, you can just do it on the weekends. Look, one, I think certain people are likely to be structurally excluded, because most people in low-wage jobs also work on the weekends. This is why Starbucks is open on the weekends. But two, I think it's also the case that the people who are most at risk of being victims of the pandemic, e.g. essential workers, e.g. doctors, who literally have to be there because there is a public health crisis going on, are the least likely to be able to vote in this referendum, which means it is structurally unrepresentative of the people, therefore it's likely to be worse, whereas those people would be represented when their elected representatives vote, because they do get election day off, or at least a lot of countries do get election day off, and that's good. Or what they're saying is we'll just give everyone the day off when this comes. But one, if you're putting a bunch of doctors out of hospitals one day every 2 weeks to change the policy, probably a pretty bad thing. You probably need those doctors in those hospitals. Finally, they say, look, sometimes people lobby to go. But the problem is this is also an issue for them, which is saying, as long as a small group is dedicated, you can just, one, spread massive amounts of fake news. You can convince people to do these types of things without standing up for it, and they don't have to, take the science. Because, look, people are convinced by what they see on Facebook. They are convinced, I forgot to take my mask off. They are convinced by what they do these types of things. I'm really pro-mask mandate, I guess it fits into my speech. But they are really pro these types of things, and therefore they do it. So even if politicians are paid off by big interests, they also still don't want a disaster on their hands. They don't want a bunch of people to die, and they also don't want to destroy the economy. Because in 2 to 4 to 6 years, they're going to have to face a re-election. And if they've massively fucked up the overall long-term handling of the situation, they are screwed over. This means that I think, one, the democratic principle doesn't matter, because we ought to do everything we can to protect life. But even if it does matter, it's a really bad way to aggregate these types of preferences. And as a result, this is true. I think they just say that it's very impractical to have people to do these types of things. and like you do a referendum faster. Like most governments have types of like emergency powers where you can, like the president or governor of a state can automatically impose a mask mandate before you do these types of things, which means these things can move very quickly at the speed that is necessary. The thing is if you're modeling this is happening in one day. Finally, I also just think that I pressed into this earlier. Look, this is an absolute logistical nightmare. Like the government should be spending all of their time and all of their funding to fighting whatever the public health crisis is. They now have to spend a bunch of organizational capacity to get voting machines out to everyone, to get poll workers to the polls in like 2 days. That's so difficult. We say there's no structural reasons why it's hard to do a referendum. Like, it is just expensive to get everyone out there. It is difficult to logistically organize. First of all, there might be a health crisis going on, so maybe everyone congregating in one place to vote might not be a great idea. Like, this is a terrible idea. And now they're spending tons of time focusing on this instead of actually fighting the pandemic. I think that's pretty bad. I will take opening.
Yeah, do it with a phone, do it with a mail-in ballot, but importantly, morality does matter. Policies like zero COVID that have caused more harm to the economy and mental health than life-saving COVID proves this isn't just an optimization function.
Okay, one, if we're talking about authoritarian regimes, I'm not sure if they would just agree to vote anyway, so I'm not sure if they're even included in the motion. But two, I think it's like that's not technically true. Take closing.
All of your harms are contingent on this referendum voting against mass mandates or stuff that could be good. What are your reasons for why these referendums would be wrongly voted on?
Okay, yeah, sure, about to go into that, great. Why are people terrible at assessing risk? One, they're often unfamiliar with these types of topics, they don't think about it. Everyone thinks bad things can't happen to them. They have an optimism bias, which means they tend to think they are smarter, stronger, healthier than other people, despite the average person ranks themselves as an above average driver, which obviously cannot be true. Two, they don't know what they're talking about, which is to say, I just don't understand how disease spreads, so I'm gonna have to listen to whatever I see on Facebook. But the problem is trolls get pushed significantly more, which you do this. Three, to the extent that we talk about trust in government, if the government is telling me to vote one way, I'm not sure how much I trust the government if that's the problem. Anyway, but four, I think you should have a major incentive to like just hate masks. They're inconvenient. I don't like them. They're annoying, right? And if I don't think I'm going to get COVID, then why should I worry? Because I'm really bad at assessing the risk, I vote against something that is actually in his interest. I think governments tend to do these things better because they can consult teams. It's more of an academic question, and they still care about the issues like the economy too. Because the thing is I am only thinking in the short term, whereas the government tells the yes is somewhat short-termist, but it has to be slightly the longer term. They have to care slightly more. Finally, I think what Nicole tells you that is important is that you turn against each other, you trust each other less. At least when a doctor tells me about it, I kind of buy into it, right? Just like Dr. Fauci is at least somewhat objective, somewhat unpartisan. Maybe in the US it didn't work, in a lot of other countries it did. When I think it's just my neighbors who voted for these, like these fucking idiots, who are probably on the opposite side of the political spectrum, who have no idea what they're talking about, and they're determining public health policy, like why on earth would I believe them? If anything, I'm likely to become substantially more against the policy. I'm likely to trust them substantially less. I'm likely to think that all of my neighbors are full of shit. I'm less likely to follow the requirements there, and I'm more likely to just get into a situation where I die. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
Alright, I think that's deeper and calling a member of government. Here.
Hello, sorry, using paper notes for the first time in a long time, have to arrange. I use Excel usually, so it's much superior. Give me a second.
Awkward question, does anyone have a USB-C charger? My phone's about to die.
I got one.
Can I please plug
No,
it?
yeah, you can plug it in.
Actually, can I move here and plug in my laptop? It's also gonna die.
Big last round.
Thank you so much.
I need to
Really
make a
appreciate it.
decision without my.
While we're waiting with the POIs, OLO 3rd minute, CO 6th minute, that's your time. Make sure you know.
Okay, I'm gonna time you for this speech, because they're gonna go to the bathroom, but I feel
I'll
like
come
we
back.
can keep going.
I have a timer.
What?
I have a timer.
Okay, well, I don't know. Just, if you want a second one. Okay. You can start when you're ready.
Okay, just. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. First premise I'm going to analyze. Why in the vast majority of cases, the referendum is going to be the same as the parliamentarian decision, thus positive action in this particular case, if it's a good idea to have mass mandates, if they will vote for mass mandates. Three structural reasons. Firstly, Notice that the vast majority of people are rational, informed, adequate people. Firstly, because they have most likely been through, all types of medical processes. They have been in a hospital, they have been vaccinated, they have lived through this. Secondly, because usually they're informed with okay-ish media in this particular case. Like even if you think The Economist is a bad media and this sort of thing, or the Wall Street Journal, they're most likely have an incentive to be objective because they, they want to appeal to a large pool of people, so they're likely to spill out the facts. Secondly, governments also regulate the media, so they're likely to, make these proper things, etc. Thirdly, most people feel, guilt for this sort of thing. They feel personally affected that if they don't vote for this particular thing, they are the ones, who literally killed people because they didn't do this sort of thing. And it's easy to guilt trip these individuals into making this sort of action prove this way. Secondly, even if they're selfish, as all say in this debate, you still have selfish reasons to be associated with this sort of thing. Why? Because these individuals have the capacity to think for long-term time, to imagine what the world will be when COVID is over or what this particular thing is. And in most cases, they're able to weigh up these cost-benefit analysis and know that this particular action is the part of going through this sort of things. Thirdly, I don't know why Fauci isn't on both sides of the house. We also have experts who most likely say the facts in these particular things. Why do we buy into experts? Two reasons. Firstly, we have authority figure bias because these individuals have, titles. We like to go to experts. We've been taught this in school, like teachers, medical experts, etc. But secondly, we also have science bias. We think that this is, the adequate process to arriving in the truth, etc. What does this prove you? This proves you that the necessary 51% threshold that we have to win in order for this to happen, even if some people are vote stupidly, even if some of these sort of things, the vast majority of people will vote positively in this particular case. What is then the asymmetry in this particular regard? The risk of potentially the referendum going the other way gives incentive to both the state and society to educate the remaining people in these particular regards, meaning that the impacts for this sort of thing means that they're more compliant with mask mandates, they're more compliant with vaccines, so we have more people buying into this particular process. So then the risk is, offsetted by the rewards of this sort of things. Why currently does the state and individuals, both actors, do not engage adequately with these sorts of things? First thing, notice that states have different things to prioritize. It's not just healthcare, you also have educational system, you also have infrastructure, etc. So if they have to allocate money, and by the way, this is an example from my country, Bulgaria, if they have to allocate money to, let's say, build a highway or have information campaign for vaccines, let me ask you which the two they're likely to fund in this particular case, etc. Because there is necessary pressure for you to do this sort of thing. You like to allocate money on this, but it's not just money allocation. It's also what are you talking about? What is in the media space? How much emphasis are you necessarily putting towards these particular things that you do not have incentive? Secondly, average individuals. And this is another mechanism here. People do not want to go into conflict with individuals that much, right? They know I'm going to do me, I'm going to vote, I'm going to wear my mask, etc. But they're not going to conflict themselves with other individuals because it's scary to them, they don't like it. But when there is a referendum, they'll necessarily do this, right? Because they know that every additional vote that you're doing, you're likely to pull this sort of thing, etc. Bottom line is, in society, most likely these 30% will exist, and these are a problem if they're not wearing masks, if they're not taking vaccines, etc. Before get into how we flip this,
Yeah, so governments always have an incentive to educate people because it's a public health crisis that relies on society all being compliant. Every piece of rhetoric you used indicates that there's a right answer. Why can't we just arrive at that sooner with the government?
Your case does not work because the governments will most likely fear backlash, they have other priorities to cater to, etc. When we put this in the focus, when it's the main priority, when there could be a referendum that basically ties them necessarily to that referendum, you have to do the sort of thing. So you can't have your cake and eat the two at the same time. What changes on our side of the house? Now when you have this sort of thing, the state is likely to be more engaged into this sort of thing, to fund more information campaigns, to give more media time to Fauci to talk about these sorts of people. Average individuals are also likely to be, more engage with more people, inform them, etc. But notice other mechanism also. NGOs. In the status quo, NGOs will most likely be protesters against the government and most likely will say, why aren't these mandates put on, etc. On our side of the house, this is flipped because they're more supportive of this sort of thing and they're more likely to engage, etc. This means that on our side of the house, you have multiple different facets and factors who are all together pushing this sort of thing. Even if we decrease, by the way, with 3% or 5%, etc., this means that we have more buy-in, this means that you have less spread of the disease. This means you have less infected people, and this means that any any action you do, etc. This directly breaks all of this particular debate, because all says, but we have a perfect comparative. No, you don't have a perfect comparative if people do not engage in this sort of thing. So this is why you should prioritize more people buying into this system, because it presupposes their impacts of this particular thing. Before I get into the second extension about oppositional parties, I'll take CO.
When people pursue these policies, they're going to dominate their political agenda. People are going to judge those parties for things like mask mandates, so they still are accountable to getting information out there. The question is, do they think they can convince everyone in 2 or 3 days? And if they don't think so, then will they pursue those policies?
I don't know, right? Like 2 or 3 days framing by OG, it's a mistake. This is not going to be a rational version of this debate. Like, come on guys, let's not debate like stupid. This stuff is recorded, people will watch it. But second, even if you have limited time for this sort of thing, because it is limited time, you have the incentive to push more, to inform more, to engage more in these particular things, etc. I want to also extend on the oppositional backlash point. OG said that for 2 reasons the opposition is going to be loud, because they're inherently conservative and they're paid off. I don't know if these reasons are true. Here are better reasons. Firstly, they like to get cheap political points by spamming out their rhetoric and take her into a new voter base that just propped up, because right now there is a pandemic and is a new and this sort of thing. But secondly, they also want to view the government as optically weak, so they're likely to amp up their rhetoric, etc. Here is something that OG doesn't say. What is the oppositional party likely to do? 3 things. Firstly, they're likely to organize protests against the main government in these particular things and make the government have to retaliate against protests, call up police in order to get people up. This furthers the deep state narrative that the people, that the state is out there to basically screw you over and do this sort of thing. Secondly, they're likely to, be more angry and talk more about this into parliament, to cater to this new voter base, to basically groom them and have them in these particular regards. Which means, this means 2 things. Firstly, the total number of people who believe this sort of stuff will increase on their side of the house, because there is more signaling based upon this sort of thing, because there are more protests, there's more action by the government to tone them down, etc. But also, the actions are more likely to do. They're likely to do things like not wear masks more, or not vaccinate even more on their side of the house, which increases the population of this sort of thing. At the end of the day, the decision is very simple. We're fine with risking it with the referendum if we're able to get more buy-in into society on our side of the house, so we're able to get the good impacts of dealing with the crisis. This is the most important impact in the debate, CG.
I think the speaker and calling a member of opposition here.
Brian, can I put your phone? The first thing I want to do is just offer a defense of the response to the principal argument from OG and make it very clear why we think that these decisions are made by the legislature. Because I think that I agree with Matt's speech in principle, which is that we're not making an a priori claim that X public health policy is superior to something else. We're not making an a priori claim that the long term is superior to the short term, or that mask mandates are superior to the economy. What we are saying, however, is that those kinds of decisions and those kind of fundamental trade-offs have to be adjudicated through a legislative mechanism that still affords legislators some degree of discretion to make these kinds of decisions. The specific reason why we don't allow the government to legislate up or down on a referendum every single policy question, because note that every single policy question affects visceral aspects of your life, like can you afford medicine via economic policy, can you afford access to food via things like anti-inflationary monetary policy that imposes a huge collective action problem in the short term. The reason why we don't allow referenda to determine these things is because people are subject to cognitive biases that operate in the short term but that dissipate over longer periods of time and can be resolved through election cycles. What are these structural cognitive biases, and why are public health crises uniquely prone to triggering these biases? Firstly, people tend to overweight the direct impact of policies over the indirect impacts of those policies. That is, it is easier for me to understand how something affects me today through my day-to-day actions, but not the second-order effects of its impacts on other people, and how, as a whole, that might make me better off over a longer period of time, in a way that I could adjudicate ex post facto in an election cycle when judging how the last 4 years as a whole has been relative to the predecessor administration. administration. Secondly, people in general tend to overweight the short versus the long term. I think this argument's already been made. Again, they may still value the short term. They may still hearken back to that short term at the election and say, you know what, that month mattered a lot more for me than the year thereafter, but in that month, you're more likely to overweight it to a degree that you might not ex post facto. And finally, people tend to overweight the availability of the loudest voice in the room. That is, when people are given highly sensationalist information in a short period of time, and particularly when they don't understand an issue, they're likely to respond to that in an emotional and visceral way. Take all the mechanisms you just heard from CG's speech, that the economist is going to solve this, that Fauci is going to solve this, that people are going to think rationally because they went to the hospital once. Yes, these things are true, but it takes longer for these kinds of rational decision-making apparatuses to think in. When you have a 2-year election cycle, for example, you have multiple people campaigning, multiple streams of information, and all that information is being tested against real-world experiences, there's a higher probability that you end up coming out to some kind of even-handed conclusion versus when you're given a very small degree, call it 2 days, call it 7 days, to make a life or death decision. First, OG.
Look, people have time to make this decision because we know it well ahead of time. They've lived through COVID, so they know what COVID is like. And on your side of the house, people have to vote for the party that they've always supported for a whole variety of other reasons. So you don't have a free choice.
So, on 2 points. Firstly, in terms of why elections can actually accomplish this outcome. You are right that the presidential election can be a shit show sometimes, but these decisions are made by legislatures, and individual legislators are in fact elected on terms of day-to-day issues that affect people. So, for example, every single congressional election or Senate election of recent memory has been about the pandemic and the specific handling, the trade-offs of things like schools, the trade-offs of things like vaccines and mask mandates, and those things are likely to be discussed because ultimately you are accountable to being elected by your local constituents based on their day-to-day experiences. That is a dominating factor. On the point about like, oh well, people are still going to be able to get information about this thing, I think our point is just that they are more likely to make bad decisions in a world in which they have a less degree of time. I'll take CG later. So, where do we win? We think that these referenda will be political games. I'm going to explain what these politics will look like in the short term and what kind of outcomes you're likely to see from the referenda. Then I'm going to explain why, as a consequence of this, A, the policies that will be passed prior to the referenda will look different, and then B, the policies you will get after repeated referenda will look different, and why those meaningful policy changes will have material impacts on the ground that will kill people. So, firstly, why do we think that these policies are likely to be bad on their side? To be clear, the policies we are talking about are likely to be passed only when they are extremely necessary, for the reason that, as government has observed, restrictions on freedom tend to be very, very unpopular and tend to be quite coercive. And so, given the choice, elected policymakers would not like to pursue restrictions on freedom because they know that it makes them less accountable over time. So if they're doing this in a short-term and urgent basis, they're doing it because they believe there is substantial urgency, that it may well be the only option to resolve a pressing crisis, that if it is not resolved in the next week, then it may grow exponentially and become something that is unstoppable. The arguments you heard about risk aversion from OG actually make this worse, because we think that on average the policies that we're getting in our world are already not enough, and they might be a bit even more risk averse on their side when it's put to an immediate vote. The problem is that when you need to call a statewide or national election in a short period of time, there's a very high propensity for the biases I've identified to be in play. Why is this? Firstly, because the turnout is likely to be structurally unrepresentative over a shorter period of time versus when you have a 2-year election cycle to inform lots and lots of people, to create infrastructure that makes this as accessible as possible, to create days when many people can go and vote, versus giving people a smaller degree of time, which means people with less flexibility are less likely to vote. Note that this argument is agnostic to whether or not you create a holiday or have it being mail-in, because even things like information about where to vote, when to vote, and how to get your ballot in by time can make a significant amount of difference, and even if certain groups participate just 10-20% less on the margin, it then artificially inflates the voices of other people who tend to be unrepresented in the population because they have more time, more resources on hand. Secondly, the right information is less likely to get out to people. I'll take you later. The reason why is that extremely sensationalist messaging does better in a short-termist environment for a couple of reasons. A is that it takes longer to get the kind of anti-sensationalist messaging that can fight back against this. The kind of economist or digesting an Atlantic article or thinking more kind of solidly about long-term consequences requires critical engagement with kind of boring ideas that are remarkably unsexy and therefore generally takes a longer deliberative process, whereas things that Tucker Carlson tells you tend to be highly sensationalist in a short period of time and therefore tend to get a much stronger response. On top of that, we think that there is a stronger incentive for radical actors to put this information out in a referendum environment. I'll explain why in a second.
If your argument in this debate is you have low amounts of time, that means that the fear of the pandemic is increased, which means that you are in fact more likely to vote for mask mandates and pro-vaccination rather than not voting for feasibility.
I think the problem is this fear is not often homogeneous. So for example, there will be policies that cause a small cost in the majority but a very, very disparate benefit for the minority, i.e. lifting mask mandates when black people still haven't vaccinated at an appropriate rate, but white people are doing the majority of the voting. That may still cause a positive second order effect over the long term, in that if you contain COVID, then the economy as a whole recovers better, but that's something you can't judge in a referendum, but you might judge over a 2-year election cycle when you have that kind of ex post facto evaluation. I think the final thing is, again, insofar as there will be a significant overweighting of these short-term costs, there are two consequences. A is that many of these collective action problems will now be dealt with in a worse way. That is, even if you can pass the policy, legislators who are risk averse to there being some kind of negative opposition to the referendum will pursue less strict policy or more delayed policy to increase the chance that it passes versus what they would otherwise pursue. This can make a huge difference, right? If this pandemic is growing at an exponential rate, then just pursuing the mask mandate a week later means that you start flattening the curve when you have double the cases, and that means the number of people under the curve is 2x, which means twice as many people can die. Secondly, if the first referendum fails and you have to pursue successive referendum to pass successive policy, then it's likely that the successive referenda are on more watered down versions of policies that are less backed by science, less tied to expert opinion, insofar as they are more likely to pass. Again, people die as a result of these referendums. We're very proud of the votes.
Thank you, the speaker and colleague of what you're here.
Three, two, one. Okay, guys, Roman warned you not to get technical, so if you want to get technical, I'll get technical in this debate because it's really problematic. Now, first of all, there is something called national state of emergency. So if it's really about like those first week of the pandemic that is really crucial, what you're probably gonna do, as every government in the world did in the first weeks of the pandemic, is actually make a state of national emergency, which allows you to disregard all of these laws. What happens at a later stage is, if you want to continue those laws, you have to pass them. And obviously, and let's get technical here, OG said, after you announce the law, you're then going to hold this particular referendum, which allows us to say the following thing. Well, obviously they're going to plan when they're going to announce that law, and it's going to take a significant amount of time for them to kind of have the opportunity to show people what is going on. That significant amount of time is not 2 years. 2 years is completely out of this debate. We're talking about a couple of weeks where things can get settled down and they can do that. Why did you make me do all of this is completely problematic. But let's continue with the actual debate and what we want to talk about here. Look, guys, the problem of basically how these things takes longer is what exactly Roman asked you in the POI, which is, yes, people and actors, some of them fear what is happening right now, but exactly because of that fear, they're far more likely to be basically fired up to actually joining that conversation. It was very easy when people announced the mandates for people who are pro-vaccine to just say, oh, that's a good thing, oh yeah, I support that person. But now, when their own lives are on the line, they're going to be there on Facebook, they're going to be there talking to their friends, they're going to be there actually trying to change people's minds because they know that if they don't, they're actually going to suffer those consequences. It's the same for any news outlet out there. It's not just about, well, there's already mandates, might as well go on Fox and say that those mandates are bad and kind of gain the cheap political points of view without actually suffering the responsibility of the consequences. Now you have to suffer the responsibility of the consequences, because if you come out on TV and say, no, we're not doing vaccines, we're not doing all those things, and then people vote for those things, you're the person who is going to suffer. You're the person who would not have a hospital bed when they needed to. And this is how the incentive mechanisms are changed. Then you say, the generic analysis, which is hugely unsophisticated, to say people are short-termistic. Of course people are short-termistic. We tell you, in this case, that's a good thing. But above that, does not mean that the other existing biases that we already have, which Roman talked about, are actually prevalent in this case. Obviously, they're going to care about their businesses and all of these things, but they also have preconceived biases. We live in civilized societies where everybody has gone through the education system, they understand the health system, they understand all these things, they have preconceived biases to trust these individuals, and in the short term they're likely to allow them to do their job. On the comparative, the crucial thing in this debate is the buy-in that we get from people. Before I continue with this comparative, I'll take any of these.
Oh, no, go.
Okay. Your point on buy-in is basically that if people vote for something, then they're likely to buy into it over time. But that buy-in relies on persuasion, which you will still have even after the policy is passed on our side of the House for months and months, precisely because you do want that buy-in. At least the policy passes on our side.
No, but here is what we extend on this debate, which was very crucial and the extremely good team on opening government didn't realize, which is the fact that we need people to gather rope to convince people. Because it is one thing to go after the fact, after the mandates are already there, and the incentives of the individuals, all participating in the puzzle of convincing people, are much better on our side of the house when there's actually something on the line. It is very easy for you to stand up and say, I support something. It's much harder for you to fight for it so that it actually has an impact. This is how we win this debate. Now on the comparative in the long term, there are two main comparative points here. Firstly, on the long term, the buy-in is connected to the ability and the capability of the government to actually implement its laws, to actually make people compliant. And believe me, I come from a fairly democratic country where also people are kind of used to not following the law. And it's very easy to not follow the law, you know. It's very easy for me not to wear a mask right now. And I'm unsure which government is going to, for example, go out there and make 10,000 fines today, or close down 10,000 businesses. So if people are really not convinced with what is going on, it will be very hard. But crucially, if you make a mandate and say to people, if you are not vaccinated, you will not go to a restaurant, what's going to happen? Black markets for restaurants, or people are just gonna stay home, or they're gonna organize something and they're still not going to get vaccinated, which essentially means that they're gonna continue to do what they do, they're going to circumvent the government, and the effect of this is going to be that people are going to fight over hospital beds, which is essentially what we don't want to do. So we don't really only care about applying the law and saying, okay, we got the law. We need to make people understand and believe in that law so that they're able to actually get the benefits of it, that they're able to actually be protected, which is hugely important in this debate. Opening.
At best, this is entirely symmetric, because if you're not following the law and wearing a mask, you're certainly not going to vote for a referendum that forces you to wear a mask every day.
Yeah, obviously some people are going to be always on the left or always on the right on these particular issues. We're talking about the middle ground people who in many of the cases can be convinced by these opportunities. What we're saying that if every possible actor now has a huge incentive to convince you to do that, that's a much more powerful mechanism to get to the end line, which is to get at least most of the people vaccinated, at least 70% of the people vaccinated or whatever, which is essentially crucial to this debate. Moreover, in terms of like our ability to like, let's talk about a worst case scenario, right? I think that's more important. I think that on the comparative, it's very okay for you to organize another referendum. Referendums are a fraction of a government's budget to a comparative. It's not something like same-sex marriage, which not many people care about in the first place, so you need like 3 or 5 years to actually get people to care about and show up this referendum to be eligible. What is far more likely to happen is that they suffer short-term consequences of their bad decisions, like in any democratic government, but then they're able to go back, have that referendum, and gain all of the benefits of huge societal buy-in that are essentially needed to actually be able to protect people. This is what we bring in this debate. This is why we win, because we want to actually help people.
I'll have to close out the round. You're here.
I can't believe in this debate about COVID, when the smallest of margins oftentimes lead to tens of thousands of people dying, Devesh is the only speaker who actually addresses why it is that the current system stability is the only way that we can ensure that decisions are made in the way of saving lives rather than going towards abstract principled ideas or like completely infeasible political goals from closing government. So I'm going to just address each team in reverse chronological order. I'm going to firstly talk about CG, then OO, then OG. The first thing that closing government tell us is, they tell us that the debate about the practical in this debate shouldn't really be about what the vote is going to look like, because everybody is reasonable and sensible, they've gone to the hospital, they feel guilty, and eventually everybody is going to be in favor of vaccinations en masse. The reason why this argument fundamentally falls is because it is solely dependent on an absurd characterization of what everybody's opinions on this issue actually is. Because even though I would really like to believe that everybody acts extremely rationally, unfortunately they don't respond to the vast numbers of people that Devesh put out, people who are oftentimes swayed by sensationalized media, people who are more concerned about their proximate, emotional, and experiential preferences over things that are told to them on TV, things that they may not have ever believed in over the last 20 years because they refuse to ever accept the fact that, maybe someone knows more than they do. So I think the issue of opening clash was that, there was a fight and there was a conflict in terms of characterization. But what I think Devesh solely brings to you in this debate is that he clarifies why it is so important that given that there are two simultaneously existing coalitions of beliefs, the fact that both there are people who are rational and there are people who don't believe in mass, why it is so important that the middle ground is likely going to be the one that we can shift in this debate because of the accountability that exists in our representative democracy that doesn't ever exist in a referendum. Then they say, but on our side at least we're going to be able to get compliance, right? So as long as all of the votes are aligned on both sides of the House, compliance means that we save more lives because people are willing to follow. The reason why this is not true is a fewfold. The first thing to note here is just to say that generally these government policies are quite easy to enforce. When it comes to things like mask mandates, even though you don't want to be compliant and you could be really angry at the government, you still need to go to work, you still need to have a job, and unfortunately you will still need to comply no matter how angry you are. But secondly, even when it does come to the effective mood of these individuals, why is it likely that on a comparative it's much worse for them? The first thing to point out here is that on their side, the effects of things like short-term politicization, and also all of the effects that Devesh explains to you about how the media compounds all of these effects, likely necessarily means that the opinions that people have that are so strong against these public health mandates not only become consolidated, but they become much more solid. They become a stance of free speech rather than one of, I don't want to wear a mask because it's uncomfortable. But secondly and more importantly, the reason why it is even more important on our side that we're able to solve this issue is because the compliance on our side likely comes from the fact that people begin to see the material differences from before these mandates were passed, and they're able to compare and contrast the differences in experiences that they faced before these mandates came around and recognize that that is the actual result, right? What Devesh here then explains to you is that he can solve the time lag issue between seeing the benefits of a policy and absorbing the harms or the quote-unquote harms of needing to wear a mask while you're working. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
Despite your straw manning, we proved that we have the necessary 51% that deals with yours and opening opposition's populism argument. The only difference is that the remaining people who don't believe in wearing masks are decreased on our side of the House, thus the crisis is alleviated and we get all the benefits.
I was going to get onto this later, but I'll just say it now. Your argument is that the, let's say, 33% of vocal, liberal, and rational people are able to convince 51% of people to pass the vote. What they don't reconcile this with is that the other side also has equal incentives, right? What Devesh explains to you is that when there are people who feel things like the first time they put on a mask and go do manual labor outside, they feel like they can't breathe. They feel like the vaccine mandate is likely something that makes them sick on purpose for no reason, and it is something that's stifling their individual freedom. They too also feel very strongly, and they also feel like they don't want to have these government policies passed, even if it is for selfish reasons. So all of the arguments that they tell to you about how you can consolidate a majority from a very opinionated vocal minority is symmetric on both sides. But what Devesh clearly explains to you is that when the middle ground is given enough time to realize the benefits and reap the benefits of these mandates existing, it means that they will never be swayed in a way that allows them or gives them a mechanism to turn around mask mandates through vis-a-vis a referendum, right? The fact that we enforce these mandates in the first place means that everybody necessarily needs to face the reality that they are on net better for society and on net better for you. The last thing then that I want to address is just this idea of like the state of emergency coming from closing government. I would say firstly, most governments have huge reasons why they would not want to call a state of emergency until like 90% of other countries have already done so, just given like, you know, the image of their governance and the image of what's going on in their country and why they don't want to have panic, because usually that ruins their like economic stability. But secondly, even if this is true, all of the analysis about like proximate experiential preferences and the lack of accountability and sensationalized news are still likely going to appear onto the referendum after this quote-unquote state of emergency happens. And the reason why all of this is incredibly important is because necessarily on their side of the house, there is going to be a delay. There is going to be a possibility of a vote going a wrong way, and they cannot say, no matter how much they want to, guarantee every single vote is going to go the right way. So necessarily, people will die, and the compliance that they tell us is just not enough of an impact to override it. Lastly, I'll go on to OG.
Far more important than people being short-termists is the politicization of COVID as a hot potato that leads to Trump actively spreading COVID misinformation, muting Fauci because Biden got there first.
Right. Which would also happen in a referendum because like Republican politicians want to capitalize on the latent like discomfort and unrest with the mask mandate as a whole, and they would want to capitalize on that, build on that, and create a political platform. Like politicians always want to have a political win. So in a referendum, you just present them another chance to showcase that they have the majority in the country, that they are the ones that represent the will of the people. So I think it's just worse on your side of the house. So last thing that I want to address, like the individual claims from opening government. I think the first thing that they tell us is a principle, which I think most teams already agree, is like one that is too simplistic in terms of, yes, democracy in totality is probably very great, but the fact that referendums on many issues is so impractical means that representative democracy is oftentimes necessary, and this is one of those cases. They don't really provide to us necessary criteria to explain why this differentiates from any other policy in any meaningful way. So I think principally they don't stand. And the last thing that they can tell us is like, you know, risk-averse politicians lead to delayed action. But at the end of the day, if you read the motion, it's like the government still needs to make this policy. It's just that referendum confirms it. So on their side, they at best have longer delays for things to pass. I'm very proud to oppose.